Good evening. My name is Dextro. I'm a graphic designer and programmer. I run the website Dextro.org, which since 1995 shows abstract graphic experiments that I often used for flyers or record labels, but that were originally made without commercial intention. In 1997, I started Turux.org with Leah. It showed abstract animations that generated movements, images, and sounds from mathematic equations. A year ago, I closed Turux. Leah now publishes her own projects on her website remove.org, and all the works that I had made for Turux can now be seen on Dextro.org. The software I use for making algorithmic animations is named Director and is by Macromedia. It is an authoring software and used to be the equivalent to PowerPoint under Windows, but it offers much more than just the possibility of placing images and text on a timeline and to make links between keyframes. It lets you control all properties of an object through mathematical calculations. The scripting language under Director is named Lingo. It's easy to learn, but nevertheless quite comprehensive. The format for publishing such animations on the internet is named Shockwave. Most of the animations I make are interactive, allowing the viewer to control the way objects move and images build up. Others contain random factors that make them look different every time they get started. In any case, these scripts generate variety within defined limits, and they can produce an infinite number of more or less different pictures from a text file, usually less than 5K in size. In a film or video, there is a timeline. Each frame in it contains the whole information and defines the movement. The same applies in a stop-motion animation or a manga. In a flash animation, it can be the same, but it is also possible to define a movement by keyframes and then interpolate it between them. There can also be frames at which the animation stops or loops and waits for input. But in algorithmic animations, at least in mine, there are no keyframes, no halting points, and although Director offers a timeline, I only use 2 frames of it. 1 frame to prepare all variables, and 1 for performing the calculations. The animation starts by passing through the first frame only once, and then goes to the second frame, where it remains, looping and performing the same calculations over and over again, applying their results to the objects it moves. By doing that, the calculation works with the same equations repeatedly, and the results of one pass become the starting values for the next one. And if I work with a large number of objects, like in most cases, then there is a second loop within the frame loop, and in it the same equations are applied to each object. The maximum number of objects Director can handle in one pass is 1000. The most simple example of such an animation is an object moving in a circle. I start by attributing the angle a certain value, and then I repeatedly add a certain number to that angle. The position of the object is calculated using sinus and cosinus. Or I can just put an object into the center of the screen, its position defined by its x and y coordinates, and repeatedly add a certain amount to x, which will make it move to the right and disappear. And this shows one problem with algorithmic animations. Objects might escape and never return. One way to prevent that would be to say, if it goes over the right edge, it shall jump back to the left edge and continue its movement from there. If I do the same on the left, top and bottom edge, I can keep the object inside the screen, even though the resulting movement might not be very interesting. Another possibility is to measure the distance between the object and the center of the screen, and then apply a force towards the center that gets stronger the bigger the distance becomes. In this situation, the object will again move to the right, but then become slower and eventually stop. The same would apply to movements in all other directions. The varying strength of the force that pulls the object back is visualized here by a gradient. It is such force fields that I use in almost all of my animations. I can introduce a point that rotates around the center and that applies a repulsing force to the object. I usually use such points, and usually they stay invisible. I will call them guide points from now on. So now two forces are pulling and pushing the object, and the path it takes is still regular, but already is more interesting. I add a second guide point, this one rotating around the first one. So now the object is pushed by two rotating points and pulled towards the center. Now the regularity of the path has almost vanished. If I put 100 objects into this force field instead of just one, and if their starting positions are different from each other, for example, if they are spread randomly across the screen, then you can imagine that their paths will all be different from each other as well. Not because they follow different rules, but because these rules have different results in different situations. One object might be closer to guide point 1, another closer to guide point 2, and it is these distances that define the forces that are applied to them. And if I take three distances to three guide points and define a relationship between them in one or more equations, and if I use the result of these equations to control the forces, then this procedure is basically enough to generate an infinite variety of shapes and patterns. It's not so important what these equations look like in detail. What is more important is the level of their cross-linking. If you use three or more such equations that relate parameters to each other, you can expect to see something unexpected to result from it. Images and paths that result from this often show a level of complexity that contrasts the simplicity of the underlying equations. I think in all sciences that work with non-linear systems, it is known that they contradict human intuition as they lead to results that we wouldn't expect to arise from such simple conditions. The best known examples of that might be fractal pictures. Their equations are extremely simple, but the resulting images contain infinite information. So I usually work with distances, but also angles between points that I put into relation to each other and use the result to define attraction, repulsion, or change in direction. This leads to dynamic movements. But in Director, objects can also leave their mark where they once stood to paint trails. And the size of an object can also be just 1 pixel. Its transparency can be adjusted in 100 steps, and this allows to paint images with fine shading and gradients and in high resolution. For that purpose, it's also possible to put 2 pixels with different color and transparency on top of each other, or to use objects that consist of more than 1 pixel in different colors, which would result in a trail that changes its color depending on the direction it takes. I usually don't do that, but force fields can be represented by gradients, and their overlapping effects can be simulated that way too. And force fields don't have to grow gradually, but can also oscillate and interfere with each other. So a system of force fields makes objects move on different paths, depending on their starting positions, even if they all follow the same rules. Such an animation showing a big number of objects with the same behavior, but with different applications of this behavior in different situations, usually looks like group behavior of animals. Animals too have the same set of rules in their heads, but still behave individually, depending on the situation they're in. Indeed, it is easy to make animations that look like a flock of birds or a school of fish. I think the transition from geometric to biologic-looking movements can be seen here. The red object is attracted by one particular white object, and all the white ones are pushed away by the red. And already it looks as if they have certain intentions, as if they hunt and flee. Of course, the script is very short and simple, and you wouldn't expect something organic looking to result from it by just reading it. But these simple rules are similar to those that govern nature, and that's why the resulting movements look natural. And images that are drawn this way may remind us of natural shapes and structures, like rocks, wood, sediments, clouds, or water. This leads me to the question whether nature can be described with mathematics, which sometimes arises among scientists. Some people even think mathematics are an invention of man and that numbers only exist in human imagination. And then mathematic terms like square root are used to support that view because they seem artificial, theoretic, and unrealistic to some people. But a square root appears whenever the strength of gravity or radiation is set into relation of the distance to its source. So it is a natural feature of the three-dimensional space. And with the infinitesimal calculus, even the most complex patterns that appear on the shells of sea snails can be calculated. So if I see how easily natural movements and shapes result from mathematic equations, I have to support the view that mathematics is a language that is very suitable for describing the world. And the fact that there are some things that can be described with mathematics but cannot be seen in the natural world doesn't refute that. Those of you who are familiar with the working mechanisms of cells might know that a border between chemomechanical functions and life cannot be seen anywhere. For example, the process of attaching and removing proteins along a skeleton of fibers that constitute the mechanism for movement in some cells is understood completely as interaction between molecules. It could just as well be translated into chains of mathematical conditions. And yet, if you watch the cell moving, you might think it wants something. When I work on these animations, no matter if they are movements or drawings, I often come to a point where the interlinking of conditions leads to an irregularity, a fault, something that doesn't fit to the rest of the picture, and it is these often unexpected disruptions of the uniform that are most rewarding for me. But they can easily be very small or so big that it is difficult to recognize them, or they might just lie somewhere outside the borders of the screen. So the aim is to adjust the parameters in such a way that these ripples or twirls or interferences become clearly visible. For the calculation, it doesn't matter if one number is 10 times bigger or smaller, but that can make the difference between regular patterns or noise on one side and interesting shapes on the other side. And often the numerical window is much smaller than that. So I have to contain the variations that random factors or user interaction create within certain limits to ensure that the image doesn't look the same every time or remains white because all objects escaped somewhere. Such a frame has to be found for every parameter, and that means I have to spend much time just watching the animation run, usually much longer than I need for programming it. This is the relationship between 2 points. One follows the other in a way that is defined in these lines, but only one is visible and it draws a line like this. And if I move the path of the invisible guide point, the line starts to move like this. But it would also be possible to draw many lines instead of one, each with a slightly different parameter. Then I get a plane. And this plane can be moved in the same way like the line before. In this way, I made the following video. The sound was made in Sound Edit. As the generation of one image can take time, from seconds to even minutes, certain movements can only be seen in real time if they are pre-rendered and later combined to a QuickTime movie. The movement that results from that looks completely different from the original animation, as in this example. These lines get drawn from top to bottom, and only in a video can we see them move. Look at this. It seems quite complex, doesn't it? A spiral rotating very slowly, and from it come in regular intervals small dots that twirl around and vanish into the spiral again. Later, this turns into two small spirals. And in the beginning, it looks completely different altogether. The whole movie is 8 minutes long at this speed. If you asked me to write such a script, I couldn't do it. And if anyone can, then the resulting script would be very long, because the author would have to try to control every aspect of this combined movement separately. But actually, this script is quite short. In the left part, the parameters get defined, and only the right part controls the movement. And there, only these 4 lines actually calculate the coordinates of the pixels. The changing shapes through time result from constantly increasing the value of this one parameter. So this short script can generate a complex combined movement that draws varying shapes over time by just altering one number. This is typical for most of the scripts I write. Please note that there is no separation into different movements and no differentiation for the different parts of the video. One script controls all pixels all the time. I don't think this can be made intentionally. I think it can only be found by experimentation. I'm not telling you this to make you think you cannot do what I do. On the contrary, this is how you could do that if you want. And I think such things usually don't come from people who sit in an office and who are told to program within defined limits and with certain aims. In such a situation, it is unlikely that people are allowed to experiment and only afterwards see if something useful has transpired. This can only be done by people who work independent from commercial aims, at home, at night, smoking marijuana, and who maybe have to go to an office job during daytime in order to be able to afford all this. And I have to tell you that I do just that, because although my way of life leads to works that get recognition by others, it is still illegal. If more such people would stand by their way of life in public, the pressure on them would maybe become less. Originally, this script painted flowers like these. To be honest, I never understood why these blossom-like shapes form. Sometimes they even look like blossoms seen from the side. The script is not a fractal script in the usual meaning, but still the pictures show infinite information. When I zoom into it, you can see spirals inside of spirals. Here, two invisible guide points are used, but this time there are minimum and maximum limits that decide which distance has a stronger effect. This leads to pictures like these. Moving the guide points results in a video like this. And if I include the continuous numbers all objects have as factors, and if I place the objects along a circle as a starting position from which they get moved by the force fields, a distorted ring like this appears. The best series was the one that showed curved and rippled planes with a comprehensible spatial shape, and with tears and holes and overlapping edges. Such discoveries sometimes make me think it might be possible to find mathematical descriptions of scientific relevance that way, especially when the script is, again, very brief, like here. Only twice have I used scripts made by other people. One was a fractal script, and the other one a script for a 3D cube that can be rotated by user interaction, which Leah and I took from Che Tamahori's website, who put it there for free consumption. We then turned it into an 8-channel audio mixer. Director doesn't offer many possibilities for processing audio. That's why I usually don't do that at all. The more complex of my animations don't run in real time anyway, and if I want to combine a video with sound, I don't need Director. But at least it can fade sounds in and out and shift them from left to right. The idea was to start 8 short audio loops with exactly the same time length at exactly the same time, and then use the otherwise invisible Z coordinates of the cube's corner points to control the volumes. Every corner was assigned an audio loop, and the more forward that corner came when the cube was rotated with the mouse, the louder the respective sound became. So this was our 3D sound mixer. Here's an example of the X and Y coordinates being translated into sound. Rotating the spiral quickly with the mouse triggers another sound. In theory, it would be possible to extract numbers from any one of my scripts and use them for controlling audio, not with Director alone, but with a MIDI stream to synthesizers or other applications like Max or processing. What that would sound like depends mostly on the interpretation of these numbers, what kind of effects are allocated to them. In any case, a perfect synchronization to an animation would be possible if this were desired, and a wide range of modulations. By the way, these were the only real 3D scripts I used in my animations. Sometimes images seem to have a third dimension, but actually they don't. Of course, Director cannot only export streams of numbers, but also import. Numbers can be transferred from other applications, the amplitude of an audio signal can be analyzed, websites can be read, and all data that the operating system offers, like date and time, can be interpreted. With the help of translation devices, Director can be fed with just about anything, like temperature, air pressure, movement of people or cars, and this can then be used to build an installation in the real world. When I was in Shanghai a year ago, I could see many facades of houses that were animated with colorful neons, but none of their movements were dynamic and none were interactive. But that would be very easy to do and would enrich a city very much, in my eyes. Children could play with houses then. I would like to answer some questions I'm sometimes asked. One question is where my inspiration comes from. It comes from nature and science. In nature we can see all kinds of fascinating shapes and forces, but seldom do I reconstruct them just as they are. Instead, I try to extract single mechanisms. In order to understand and visualize them, cannabis-induced meditation is very helpful to me. In this condition, I sometimes gain deep understanding and, with my closed eyes, can see images so stable and so clearly that I can rotate and zoom into them. So, more often than directly from nature, my ideas come from my mind in meditation. Another question is how much of what I make is random or done by the computer. Well, everybody who works with computers knows that by themselves they do precisely nothing, and there's just one thing that's random, and that is noise. So every shape and movement that is not completely arbitrary needs underlying rules. I just use random factors for creating variety within a strictly defined frame set of such rules. One more question. Do I always know what I'm doing? Well, not always. Of course, I have to have an idea when I start to write a script, but I don't have to stick with it and discard everything else that might appear. Once a frame of rules is set up, I often experiment just with the code, and in this stage, it is not necessary that I always understand what I'm doing. This process is then more like sowing and harvesting. This is the Sierpinski triangle, named after the Polish mathematician who defined it. The positions on the edges of a triangle are filled with the number 1, and then two numbers are always added to each other, their results forming the next line of numbers from top to bottom. After that, even numbers are given one color and odd numbers another color. But here it gets really interesting. Peter Plichter writes in his books, in which he describes the 3D space with prime numbers, that this triangle can also be found in a completely different field, in thermodynamics, meaning in the continuous collisions of gas atoms. If we look at an object that is randomly attracted by any one of three fixed points, like the corners of a rectangle, and if this object is always stopped halfway, then its position marked, what appears after many iterations is exactly the Sierpinski triangle. I experimented with this procedure using, for example, 4 attractors instead of 3, which surprisingly led to the same results. After that, I didn't stop the objects halfway, but at other distances, and so on. In such experiments, I could harvest a number of pictures as a byproduct, the most surprising of which was actually fractal. There are no planes in it. No matter how much I zoom into it, there are just lines. By the way, the triangles that are so typical of the Sierpinski shape also appear if we apply the addition rule to a line of random numbers. And similar patterns can be found on the shells of the sea snail Oliva porphyria, where they are formed by the interactions between 4 substances that amplify or weaken each other. Also here, the pattern builds up along the edge of the snail, so it is again a relationship between values along a line. This is another example of a picture that is generated along a line. The rules here are similar to a cellular automata, just more simple and in only one dimension. Each point on the line looks at its left and right neighbors and changes its height according to theirs. Random faults get perpetuated to the bottom, widening, forming structures like mountains and rocks. With slightly altered parameters, it starts to look like wood. And also these pictures were generated that way. I never liked fractal pictures much because the Mandelbrot and the Julia set always looked the same, but I once copied a fractal script from a magazine and translated it into lingo to experiment with it. At first, I just found the usual shapes that look like cross-sections of plant stems or Arabic patterns. But when I introduced functions like sinus and cosinus, such pictures appeared. The flickering comes from a typical property of fractals. Certain starting positions lead objects to stable areas from which they cannot escape, and therefore don't contribute to the image anymore. Why do I work only abstract? I think the general understanding is that realistic images are explicit, and abstract ones leave much room for interpretation and associations. But for me, abstract pictures are as explicit as realistic ones, if not more so. Abstract images only become ambiguous if we try to see realistic objects in them. If we don't, then they just represent force fields and relations between objects that are related to the way we think, on a level so deep that it is universal in all humans. This doesn't mean that everybody likes abstract images or that their perception isn't modulated by the experiences and preferences of the viewer, but it means that abstract images, in my view, provoke basic moods that are more or less the same in all humans. Take a look at Michelangelo's statue of David. A handsome man, everybody would agree on that, but what kind of emotions it causes in the viewer is quite unpredictable. This will be different in men and women, children and adults, shy people and confident ones. On the other hand, an abstract image can only represent one mood. I don't mean complex pictures that combine many aspects and many colors in one, but more or less isolated basic mechanisms, like in the pictures I usually make. That's just my view, of course, but when I want to express myself, I do it in abstract pictures because I feel they are more direct and concise. And I think that's also one reason why music can have such a profound effect on our feelings, because what else is non-vocal music than a movement in time, stripped from all connections to the real world, that therefore opens the door to universal mechanisms of the brain. It bypasses the intellect that always tries to analyze and compare, and it can access our subconscious directly. If you reply now that not everybody likes the same music, I can just say exactly. Because not everybody likes to have the same mood all the time and at every age, and one piece of music can change the mood of the listener into only one certain direction. I want to play a sequence from a track by Coil. After minutes of introduction, Coil come to a theme that I regard as central in this piece, and that can be translated into a visible movement. This theme is a movement that changes its direction and that is followed by two smaller ones, but it is not followed instantly, but slowly, gradually, shifted in time. I find this track very subtle and beautiful. The animation is too simple. Actually, more information could be extracted from this sound piece, but I hope you get the idea. Maybe the sensation one gets seeing this is not strong, but I think it is more or less clear. And it would be much stronger if you could drag the leading object yourself with the mouse across a computer screen. Such an animation would resist abrupt movements of the cursor in a gentle way, and I dare to say that this feels calming to all people. For Plato, ideas were eternal archaic thoughts and archetypes that could only be recognized by the intuitive mind. But soon Aristotle opposed this view, and today ideas are regarded as mere human constructs. I think there is a lack of understanding for the everlasting and unalterable mechanisms between elementary forces, for example, in today's medicine and politics, and it might be the result of that. Universal constellations of forces govern the animate and the inanimate world, and they can be found in forces of nature and in populations of animals and plants, among humans, within our body, and in our mind. They are, for example, attraction from great distance, repulsion in close vicinity. Attraction from one object to another, repulsion in the opposite direction, which leads to continuous pursuit without ever meeting. Suppression of weaker elements, at the same time total dependence on them, like between predator and prey, pressure that builds up against strong resistance until it bursts out, or that can be reduced in small steps if resistance is not so strong, like in earthquakes or societies. Non-linear processes, positive and negative feedback loops. Oscillation and interference. All these systems of forces are empty and invisible until a substrate is added, like objects that are moved by these forces and thereby form all kinds of shapes and paths. I would like to show you how some of the animations build up, which is interesting because there you can see how objects are caught in cycles and return to the same position again and again. Here, a single object is sent on a modulated circle path and gradually draws this pattern. If I use more objects, the pattern appears more quickly, but it looks the same. So the lines in this pattern are not drawn one after the other, but all at once, in small sections. Also, other scripts paint pictures that become more and more dense over time but don't change their shape, because the drawing objects come back repeatedly and continue where they left before. This is one thing I hope to find out in the future. There are bees that, when they are together in a cluster and if threatened by an enemy, somehow manage to lift their wings in a remarkably coordinated way. These movements lead to the display of waves and spirals on the surface of their cluster, which confuse their enemies. The task is to find out what rules these bees follow. They must be the same for every bee, but still, when linked together, they must result in a spiral. This animation here is not the result yet. I just superimposed a spiral onto bees. I've never delivered a lecture before and was wondering what benefit you gained from it, especially since you're architects. I know that there is now software for constructing 3D shapes with force fields and other algorithms, and that its greatest innovation might be that you can now define a frame within which a variety of designs will be generated, from which you can then choose. Maybe it has helped you to see some of my scripts. But what I really want to tell you is that there are things that can only be found in experiment, and I therefore hope that you can be independent from other people's demands and financial interests, and can allow yourself to do just that, experiment. And one more thing, nature is really great and it is worth being preserved. Thank you.